Now, neo-functionalism comes along after functionalism, and this is actually kind of like the big kahuna, right? So functionalism is kind of like a would be, by many people's accounts, a kind of naive foreshadowing of what neo-functionalism eventually became. And neo-functionalism is the theory that many people would say actually was decisive in the establishment of the European Union, or the European coal and steel community. And our key figure here, there were a number of these people, but what the key figure we're going to look at is Ernest B. Haas, who was alive from 1924 to 2003. Now, there's a great quote here, and I just wanted to share it with you, and you can see it on the screen. Converging economic goals embedded in the bureaucratic, pluralistic, and industrial life of modern Europe, this technical Europe that we've been talking about, provided the crucial impetus. So he agrees with the functionalists there. The economic technician, the planner, the innovating industrialist, and trade unionist advanced the movement, not the politician, the scholar, the poet, the writer. And you might say that sounds a little sad because, well, don't you want the poet and the scholar and the politician, the writer? Shouldn't these people be involved? After all, these are important people in history. Sure, okay, that's fine. But what Haas, I think, is trying to recognize is what the functionalists recognized, and that is the demand for a technocratic solution, the demand for capable, able-bodied experts who can deal with an increasingly complex world in a rational way. And the nation state, of course, is not really rational in the sense of what can be accomplished through scaling your production on a global playing field. So Haas, I think, accepts the lure of this call to technocratic rationalization. Where Haas disagrees with the functionalists is the automatic aspect of it, right? He wants to focus less on the automatic lure, the automatic call. He still sees some Kantianism inherent in that, despite the fact that Mitrany and others were trying to get away from the Kantianism. Haas still thinks that you haven't brought in, with functionalism, enough of a focus on human decision making. Sure, he accepts modern society is changing, and it's changing people, it's changing the playing field that people are engaged on historically. But what we don't get a look at with functionalism is why and how exactly that complexity triggers integration. Because, it doesn't explain why one day people are doing one thing and another day people are doing another. So what Haas wants to bring in is a certain, what we can call, if you'll forgive the term, but it's a term that social scientists use a lot, messiness. Messiness, I'm sure your bedroom is messy. The room I'm in right now is a bit messy. When we say messiness, what we mean is that clear institutional pressures don't necessarily result in automatic behaviors of people. There's different agendas, there's different groups. There's cultural sort of resistances to pressures, and so messiness means you have to kind of get in to the fine grain and get away from the kind of grand pressures of history to get into the fine grain to try to understand why different forces win at different times. So who are these forces for Haas? Well, state bureaucrats would be one. They represent the interests of the state, and the state has had its bureaucrats and its interests since time immemorial. But also in a complex technocratic society, you have self-organized groups that have ability to communicate with each other, to reach out to each other, and they also have their motivations. They have separate motivations, distinct motivations to the motivations of the state bureaucrats. And so the question we have to sort of ask is, given these two different groups might be at odds with each other, which ones are going to have the most power? And we'd need to be specific here, right? If we were going to answer that question. One very powerful group for Haas is going to be industrial sectors, right? There's going to be a lot of interests shared by people working in industrial sectors, and they're going to organize, and they're going to lobby, they're going to go to government and make demands. So can we put that observation to use? Perhaps we can. The key concept of neo-functionalism then is going to be this idea of spillover. I think that's a word we've used before, but we're using it here a bit more concretely. What we're trying to sort of suggest with the concept of spillover is that integration in one sector can create pressure on others. If you, for example, integrate coal and steel, people in that sector do very well out of it. They realize efficiencies. People in other sectors are going to look at that and go, we want a piece of the action. So the process of spillover then refers to situations where one first sort of getting the ball going decision, an initial decision by governments to place one sector under the authority of supranational or centralized institutions creates pressures then, demand from other sectors to extend the authority of those first institutions into neighboring areas of policy. Now, can we think of some examples here where those areas of policy, examples of those areas of policy? Well, yes, we can. We can think of people who might, for example, want to have currency exchange rates, or even a common currency, common taxation policy, common policy on wages. We could rehearse. Everyone there would be involved, from tourists trying to go to different countries, to unions that are interested in making sure that wages are even and standards of labor are even in different countries. Small businesses that have nothing to do with coal and steel might benefit from having currency transparency between the different jurisdictions as they try to buy and sell between those different jurisdictions. So in that sense, then, you have a number of different social sectors, social fragments, if you will, where people are active and want to sort of see the technical advantages of the potential of the bureaucracy that it might potentially have for them. So here then, European integration is starting to be seen by people like Haas as a self-sustaining or self-perpetuating machine, that once it's set in motion, that spillover is going to trigger economic and political dynamics in other sectors, and going to kind of increase the demand for further types of cooperation. Now, that sounds much more fine-grained, doesn't it, than the Kantian accounts that we've been looking at up to this point in time. But it might interest you to know that even despite this fine-grainedness, Haas himself kind of renounced the theory a bit later in life, because by the 1960s, of course, you have what we've talked about before. The process of European integration stalls for a long time in the 1960s, and that all starts with de Gaulle and the empty chair and the kind of return of the logic of the nation state, and the national self-interests get reasserted over the process of European integration and hold it up, prevent that super sovereign, that supranational European process continuing to take the power from the state. And France specifically with de Gaulle sort of takes the power back. So just to remember then, anyway, of course, the key argument with functionalism had been an efficiency-based mass transfer of popular will. For neo-functionalists, it's not quite so automatic as that. There's going to have to be sectoral by sectoral realization led by elites. It's not going to be the average Joe in the street. Functionalists had kind of seen this as being beneficial for everyone. That theory doesn't really hold water. For neo-functionalists, it's not complex enough. It doesn't explain actual decisions that lead in a fine-grained, messy sense for these processes to be set in motion. So neo-functionalists focus on elites and industrial sectors, where functionalists saw a mass societal transfer of loyalty to the super sovereign bodies. Now, I made a comment at the start of this slide, and I'll sort of come back to it now. Recall, if you will, 2 weeks ago when we talked about the Schumann Declaration. And of course, the language there, if you recall, was that Europe, and I quote, will not be made all at once, but through concrete achievements which first create a de facto solidarity. Um, these piecemeal concrete achievements, I think, are in the Schumann Declaration an expression of what Haas had in mind through elite and group loyalty transfer, as opposed to mass loyalty transfer, right? Piecemeal, slow work, perhaps taking place over a very long time, as the benefits of integration become apparent to other sectors. So the coal and steel community established by the Schumann Declaration then is this first step, according at least to the neo-functionalists. Now, the question you or I might want to ask is, well, is that true? Was it perhaps just the old-fashioned state logic? What was it, just rhetoric? And you and I would have to kind of come up with reasons to argue why the coal and steel community might be, why there might be a way to sort of see it as old-fashioned nation states kind of just coming up with an awkward, clumsy solution to the problem that they had, which, as we know from previous classes, is bound up with the question of whether America could stick around very long in Europe, given the fact that it was sort of rapidly becoming this global superpower, global policeman that had to hem in and constrain Russia. And the key to doing that was to rearm Germany. So, France and Germany had to come to some kind of compromise. You could make an argument then that state interests really were the driving force, and this was just France and Germany realizing that they kind of had to put their differences aside in order to achieve the greater defense of Europe that was required by the circumstances that they found themselves in. And if we take that line, then sure, all of this is just rhetoric. But perhaps if we take Haas seriously and we see these sectors driven by below, there's something else going on here. And of course, we don't, I can't tell you which is true, but I can tell you that definitely in the 50s and into the 60s, people really took this idea of neo-functionalism seriously. And I think the proof is in the pudding in a certain respect. I think it's powerful that the Schumann Declaration uses language that's very ambitious and very idealistic. And why would it do that, I think, is the question, if all this was a sort of the old-fashioned logic of nation-state rivalry just expressing itself in a temporarily conciliatory manner. Okay? Just 2 more slides to go then today, and we'll keep it maybe just to one part if we can. I just want to talk about intergovernmentalism now, and then I'm going to kind of move on to talk about some kind of other theories. I'll do a whip around of some of the other theories that can get discussed in this context. But intergovernmentalism is really kind of the big one in our dictionary that we're going through today of different theories, our encyclopedia, if you will. So you'll recall from the previous classes how in the 1960s the nation state kind of returns, and we have de Gaulle and the French nationalist sentiment, and eventually this of course leads to the Luxembourg Compromise of 1966, which allows member states to keep their vetoes and knocks the process of European integration back decades. Okay, so in that historical context, a lot of people are kind of searching for theories that are going to help them explain this setting back of the process. One of these people is Stanley Hoffmann. Actually, he only died there in 2015, and this was not the only contribution he made in the context of his career, which was very far-reaching. He was actually a French-educated political scientist, but an American, but French-educated, and he wrote a lot of influential books exploring different facets of international politics. But in this context, he applied his intellectual capacity and innovated some concepts that we can look at to try to get a grip on what's going on in the mid-1960s with this the Luxembourg Compromise. So the key concept he comes up with is the logic of diversity, which he believes, and I quote, sets limits to the degree which the spillover process can limit or constrain the freedom of action of the governments. The logic of diversity, again, this term, the logic of diversity, implies that on vital issues, key issues for nation states, that losses are not compensated by gains on other issues. Losses are not compensated by gains on other issues. So where there's no quid pro quo, or even scratch that, where there's no quid pro quo that's even possible, and of course you can imagine issues that would be like that. Military defense. If I give you access to my defense grid, does it matter if you're willing to give me access to your butter market in exchange for that? Probably not, right? Now, I would be happy to swap access to corn to access for butter. That makes sense, right? So there's a sense in which we're compensating each other there, right? And we're gaining something in each end, but there is a kind of a zero-sum game effect that kicks in, where if I gain, you lose, and vice versa. And there are issues, according to intergovernmentalists, where this logic prevails, and one of them is defense, right? So what that means then is that if you've taken international relations theory here, you'll know about realism. Well, realism is very cynical, and that's and would argue, that history never changes. It's a perpetuating, repeating cycle of tragedy, driven by the law of interstate rivalry. That's not quite what intergovernmentalists are. That they have a realist sensitivity, but they're definitely more kind of sociologically aware and historically aware than those old school realists are. So these guys would be aware that globalization and the economic interdependency that globalization encourages, as we locate trade and production in different parts of the world, half the clothes that we wear, all the computers that we use are made in China. So if we suddenly went to war with China, that would really kind of hurt us. Conversely, it would hurt them as well, because they would lose all our money, right? So this is how interdependency, in an economic sense, constrains nation states. So I think, definitely Stanley Hoffman and people like that would recognize that interdependency makes a difference. But as he says in a sort of a famous quote, the law of the jungle is, while interdependency does make the strict law of the jungle too expensive for most states, and he says this is now this forced tameness of the world jungle, in the sense that other actors are there now, and other processes are there in global politics that constrain states. You've got intergovernmental organizations, you've got multinational corporations that are all kind of developing an actorness of their own. And so, yes, we can see a change in the role of the nation state, but that's not to say that high politics, the realm of military affairs, is going away anytime soon. It still trumps ordinary things, because of what we were talking about earlier on, that you cannot swap gains when it comes to high politics. It's not like access, swapping each other's access to each other's markets, and in that sense, then, because of the stickiness of high politics, the residual nature of state rivalry, or lack of trust is perhaps a better way to put it. We see that stateness, this sort of singular defining characteristic of the state as a sort of a military monopoly, um, is obstinate, right? It's sticky and it's not going away anytime soon. So supranational authority then for people like Hoffman is highly unlikely, highly improbable when it comes to the realm of high politics. Okay, then we're going to go right into our last slide then for today, guys. And I am today, if you'll excuse me, I'm skipping over one or two of the bits of the debate because I think they are kind of complex. And again, while they would pay you off and reward you immensely if you were to kind of read more about them, my job here is to sort of just basically, I think, outline some of the terminologies and some aspects of the debate. And so one of the last people I wanted to sort of touch on here, who isn't really dealt with in the reading that I've given you guys for today, but he's a favorite of mine, and I think he deserves some comment. So his name is John Gerard Ruggie. Now, just to mention some of the other people that get discussed in your assigned reading, there's two groups there, right? The supranationalists and the liberal intergovernmentalists. In my view, the debate between these two parties is kind of basically just a rehashing of some of the stuff we've already looked at. So, for example, you have a group of scholars called the supranationalists who come along in the 80s. Once the European project kind of gets over the Luxembourg Compromise and things get moving again, you have the Single European Act. And they would argue against people like Hoffman that spillover is real, and they're trying to sort of invigorate this concept of spillover and make it powerful again. And they come along, as I was saying, in the 1980s, and their goal is to try to explain how this project got revived. How did we get past, if high politics is king, then why from the 1980s and 1990s onwards are we starting to talk about a single market, not just a single market, but actually common foreign policy and security? So Europe kind of like starting to flirt very much with the idea of integrating stuff that seems to be partially to do, not partially, very much to do with high politics. Is spillover starting to creep into the realm of high politics? That's their question for the supranationalists. And then you also have this group, as I was mentioning, the liberal intergovernmentalists. Key scholars there include people like Andrew Moravcsik, very kind of idiosyncratic theorists that are kind of trying to borrow bits and pieces from both sort of sides of the fence, but probably at the end of the day coming down more on the side of the realists or more on the side of the intergovernmentalism than not. They're called liberal intergovernmentalists, and that's supposed to be kind of like a contradiction in terms, and you can understand why, because intergovernmentalists are supposed to be realists, not liberal. So yeah, they're seen as people trying to integrate both, the best parts of both theories. But Moravcsik, as I say, very idiosyncratically saying that really at the end of the day, domestic actors have only got one place to go. When push comes to shove, the only way the European Union can ever become more powerful is if the nation states decide it is to become more powerful. The nation state is still the exclusive venue through which that pressure can be leveraged. And so because nation states are still acting in anarchy at the end of the day, they won't budge where the risks are high. So it's kind of a return to Hoffman's idea. And I don't know about you, but I think that's kind of a questionable idea, to be honest. I mean, yes, of course, by definition, it's true in some ways. We haven't yet seen the emergence of supranational defense. But, it's every time the idea fails, it fails better. I just don't know that it cannot ever happen. I think I've certainly read, I would recommend, for example, a wonderful piece written by a scholar in OSU by the name of Alexander Wendt, W-E-N-D-T. He's in Columbus, Ohio, professor at OSU, and he has written a lot on the sort of inevitability of an emerging world state, and his arguments are really worth looking at. How else do we, manage costs of defense in a world with more and more nuclear weapons, where more and more states have nuclear weapons. So, for example, I think that's a great innovation in theory that can lead us to a certain mental dexterity in the face of the kinds of arguments that people like Andrew Moravchik are putting forward. I'm just not sure at the end of the day how sticky. I mean, obviously today it's sticky, right? But will it be sticky forever? The stickiness of high politics, I'm not sure. Anyway, I said I wanted to talk about Ruggie, and I'm going to do that now. So why is Ruggie interesting to me? He's a pretty famous guy in his own right. He is also a theorist of European integration, though he's not often cited as such. I think one of the great contributions he makes is to do with his argument that Europe has become a postmodern international political form. And what does that mean? Well, of course, modernity is always about thinking about, that classic move, right, where states separate church and state, right? That no longer are the states going to be dominated by their commitment to, I'm speaking specifically about European states here, they're not going to be dominated anymore by their commitment to the Vatican and the authority of the Pope. Once states have separated church and state, they become a law unto themselves. Of course, the critical year to understand, to know about there, is the year 1648 and the Treaty of Westphalia. And that's supposedly the birth of modern politics at that point in time. So what if that's the birth of modern politics, where states become laws unto themselves and the birth of interstate rivalry it takes place, then what is Ruggie talking about when he refers to the birth of a postmodern international political form? Well, to understand that, we have to understand that he's very serious about how the global economy changes the playing field for nation states. And he says that the effects of this global economy are really indescribable within the limits of the kind of vocabulary that people like the intergovernmentalists and the federalists, or the functionalists, are using. They're stuck within the modern vocabulary of nation states as the deciding forces, the deciding arenas where decisions to integrate or not are made. So modern international relations, because of this kind of attachment to the nation-state model, can't really get outside of what some people call the billiard ball, right? This is the idea that international relations is taking place on a two-dimensional surface, similar to billiards, or pool, or snooker, or whatever you want to call it. That spatial imagination of separate entities rolling around on a two-dimensional surface or interacting with each other on a two-dimensional surface is insufficient for Ruggie to describe what is actually very dense, complex interweaving of spaces and overlapping of spaces, emerging of spaces. And so to get a grip on that, Ruggie's arguing that we might well want to return to the Europe of Christendom, that is the Europe of medieval times prior to the birth of the modern state form. The key language he uses here is extraterritoriality. It's a good word. It's a good word to use, actually, because if you think about, for example, how Greek city-states worked or medieval city-states worked, they didn't have strict borders, where you passed from one country into another country. Sometimes those those realms would overlap. The Vatican would sort of, nominally speaking, be a governing force over all of them. But then you'd have overlapping spaces even layered underneath. So an onion might be a better metaphor than a billiard ball model. Does that make sense? So extraterritoriality refers to the idea that you're playing the game out of your identity, your loyalty. We've been talking about loyalty transfer, as sort of this idea of I'm within the billiard ball and I want to transfer my loyalty upwards to this super thing over me. But if I'm cutting an onion in half and I draw a line through it, I see that my line passes through these various layers simultaneously and at the same time. So at any given time, I have different identities. And this is why for Ruggie the word multi-perspectivalism. Multi-perspectivalism, if you want to sort of mispronounce it, but I believe it's actually pronounced multi-perspectivalism, and it's a bit of a mouthful, but that term is critical for Ruggie, right? So medievalism then is a better way to approach this, because that is referring to a system of overlapping authority and loyalties that are held together by a number of competing universalistic claims simultaneously. So I have the truth of my family that I hail from, a truth of my geography, a truth of my relationship to the Christian faith. All of these things are going on at the same time, and they are all universal claims that are true simultaneously. So can that term, medievalism, that metaphor of the onion, can that work today? And for Ruggie, I guess this is the question of he calls this the social episteme, and the idea of these multiple claims going on at the same time is key to him, because episteme is the question of how we identify with each other. Episteme then can be seen to have layeredness today when we think about the nation-state system and its antagonistic relationship to the transnational market economy, which is bringing in all manner of technological transformations to do, for example, with social media, to do with global trade, to do with the fact that we are, all of us, for example, in the United States, easily to think about this, migrants, right? And even massive migratory populations on the planet right now. People born in Indian culture, Pakistani culture in London, who grow up thinking and relating to Indian culture, but have never been there in their whole lives. And were they to ever go back there, they wouldn't be recognized as Indian by people in India because their accents are funny, and their version of Indianness is kind of mediated, perhaps not organic. I sometimes see this, for example, when I talk with people in America who have strong Irish identity. I grew up in Ireland, so I have a version of Irish identity that I kind of related to just by growing up there, and that I experienced growing up there. When I meet someone from Boston who has strong Irish identity but who's never been to Ireland and has had their understanding of Ireland mediated to them through movies, through comics, through newspapers, whatever have you, often through stereotypes, I find that like their Irishness is wildly different to mine. We almost can't relate to each other. They're ask me, do you like getting drunk, or do you fight in bars? And I'm like, what are you talking about? I have no experience of that whatsoever. It's a striking thing, but that's the American stereotype of Irishness, for better or for worse. A lot of Irish people wouldn't necessarily relate to that in real life. So that's trying to access this question of the complexity of the social episteme in modern capitalism as it brings us into these different sort of relationships of ways of identifying with each other. And so for Ruggie, I wanted to mention him as an integration theorist because I think he's trying to get us to tap into a non-specifically territorial way of thinking about identity. In other words, not having us wedded anymore to these billiard balls, and hopefully opening our minds to something beyond that. Okay, guys, so I'll wrap it up here. I'll probably have to split this episode in two, but I'll get them uploaded for you tonight, and we will see you on what are we calling this? Slack tomorrow. Okay, I look forward to reading your journals this week. Thank you so much.